The 1960s was the most vampire-laden decade in Mexican cinema history. In addition to the previously discussed Nostradamus series and El Santo's multiple encounters with the undead, vampires played significant roles in more than a dozen other motion pictures produced between 1960 and 1969. There were traditional male vampires, vampire women, vampire children, vampire cowboys, vampire aliens, vampire Asians, and even vampire comedians. The first vampire film released in the 60s in Mexico City was actually produced in April 1959, La Nave de los Monstruos, Ship of the Monsters. Producciones Sotomayor had previously jumped on the monster bandwagon with El Castillo de los Monstruos in 1957, a multi-monster horror comedy starring Antonio Espino Clavillazo. This film utilized generic versions of the familiar Universal Pictures monsters, including a vampire played by Herman Robles. With La Nave de los Monstruos, the studio tried to repeat the success with a science fiction comedy featuring a lineup of mostly original screen monsters pitted against norteño singer-comedian Lalo González Piporo. Piporo, born in the northern state of Nuevo León in 1921, was a popular radio performer who began his film acting career in 1950. In La Nave de los Monstruos, he plays a simple rancher who runs afoul of two aliens, Gamma, played by Ana Bertalepi, and Beta, played by Lorena Velázquez, who land their spaceship complete with a cargo of monsters near his ranch. In a horror twist to the science fiction plot, Beta is revealed to be from the Dark Planet and is a vampire. She betrays Gamma and their joint mission, announcing her intention to conquer Earth with the assistance of the other alien creatures. Curiously, the publicity materials for this film did not highlight the presence of an alien vampire among the film's monsters. La Nave de los Monstruos was directed by Rogelio González, a former actor and screenwriter who had previously helmed several Pedro Infante films featuring Piporo. González, although not a horror movie specialist, would occasionally return to the genre with films including Doctor Satan y la Magia Negra in 1967. In August 1960, two vampire films went before the cameras at the Churubusco Studios in Mexico City. First up on the 8th of the month was Caperucita y Pulgarcito, contra los monstruos. Roberto Rodriguez and his brother Enrique collaborated on one of the earliest Mexican cinema sound systems, and eventually the Rodriguez family established their own film production company. Roberto debuted as a director in 1939, followed by his brothers Joselito in 1940 and Ismael in 1942. Roberto Rodriguez struck gold as a producer-director in the late 1950s with little Margarita Aldecoa, renamed Maria Gracia, who starred in a number of popular movies, notably the Caperucita Roja, Little Red Riding Hood series, which began in 1959. Two sequels followed in 1960, the last of which co-starred Maria Gracia with another juvenile actor, Cesario Quezadas, nicknamed Pulgarcito Tom Thumb, after his starring role in the 1957 movie of that name. Caperucita y Pulgarcito contra los monstruos, Red Riding Hood and Tom Thumb vs. the Monsters, is an elaborately produced fantasy musical in color. There are plenty of monsters on display, including the Frankenstein's monster, a robot, various witches, ghosts, an ogre, a pinhead, a Siamese twin duo, a fire-breathing dragon, a child stealer, and so on. The vampire character, who serves as the prosecutor in the trial of the Lobo and Ogre in the first sequence, slightly resembles John Carradine from House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. He wears formal clothing and a top hat and sports a mustache. The role of the vampire went to character actor Quintin Bulnes. Bulnes would later play the voodoo priest in Muñecos Infernales and the vampire in Frankenstein el Vampiro y Compañía. However, his role in Caperucita y Pulgarcito contra los monstruos is limited, with non-traditional monsters supplying most of the monster action throughout the rest of the picture. All three of the Caperucita movies were snapped up by K. Gordon Murray, dubbed into English and released theatrically in the United States. Little Red Riding Hood and the Monsters premiered in 1964 and played at kiddie matinees under various titles for years afterward.
Now the famous characters of the fairy tale world together for the first time. It's all new when K. Gordon Murray presents Little Red Riding Hood and the Monsters. It's all in the K. Gordon Murray presentation, Little Red Riding Hood and the Monsters, in color scope.
After producing El Vampiro and El Ataúd del Vampiro in 1957 and El Hombre y el Monstruo in 1958, Abel Salazar took a year off from horror movies. But in mid-August 1960, he was back at the Churubusco studios dealing with vampires once again in El Mundo de los Vampiros. Alfonso Corona Blake was tapped to direct a script adapted by the producer's brother, Alfredo Salazar, from a screen story by Raúl Zenteno and wrestler, screenwriter, and actor Jesus Velázquez, whose ring name was aptly Murciélago, or Bat. Corona Blake had just been elevated to director status in 1956 after a long career as an assistant director, and his pre-Mundo directorial credits were almost entirely melodramas. Although he would subsequently direct Santo vs. Las Mujeres Vampiro and Santo en el Museo de Cera, Corona Blake was not known as a fantasy genre specialist. Hoping to recapture the magic of Germán Robles in El Vampiro, producer Salazar once again hired a non-Mexican to play the vampire. This time, Argentine actor Guillermo Muray was given the flashy leading role. Muray had screen experience in his homeland but had not made a Mexican movie before. A more conventional leading man type than Robles, Muray would have a long career ahead of him, occasionally playing suave villains, but just as often being cast as a romantic lead. Playing the film's hero was Mauricio Garcés. Garcés would become one of Mexican cinema's major comic stars of the 1960s, but at this point in his career, he was generally known as an all-purpose dramatic and comedic performer. Garcés would have roles in two of Salazar's subsequent horror movies, La Cabeza Viviente and El Barón del Terror, aka The Brainiac, before achieving fame in the latter half of the decade in spicy comedies. The cast of El Mundo de los Vampiros was filled out with veteran character actor José Baviera, former Miss Mexico Erna Marta Baumann, and ingenue Sylvia Fournier. Also appearing is Wally Barón as the hunchbacked assistant to the vampire. When Alfredo Salazar reworked the script of El Mundo de los Vampiros in 1972 as Santo y Blue Demon vs. Dracula y el Hombre Lobo, Barón returned in a very similar villainous role. El Mundo de los Vampiros depicts the efforts of vampiric Count Sergio Subutai to eliminate the last remaining members of the vampire-killing Coleman family who've plagued him for centuries. His nemesis is Coleman family friend Rodolfo Sabre, who just happens to be studying the effect of music on vampires. Curiously, the idea that sound could be used to battle vampires was also utilized in the Nostradamus series, shot in 1959, but not yet released at the time El Mundo de los Vampiros went into production.
The Genie of Darkness. After numerous attacks by the vampire that end up in the killing of beautiful young women, Someone must invent a way to kill vampires. Can science do it? See a scientist invent an ultrasonic method in The Genie of Darkness.
El Mundo de los Vampiros had a significant influence on subsequent Mexican vampire films stylistically and thematically. Rather than movies about a solitary vampire with at best a Renfield-like henchman, this film inspired a number of pictures featuring a vampire who leads a cult of supernatural creatures. Count Subutai, for instance, commands numerous vampire women and bestial vampire batmen. K. Gordon Murray purchased El Mundo de los Vampiros and released it to television in the United States as The World of the Vampires. The original picture was also shown theatrically in Europe. Murray, apparently pleased with his acquisition of Mexican horror movies, added another title to his catalog. Bring Me the Vampire was the dubbed version of Echenme al Vampiro, the second half of a two-film series shot in 1961 at the America Studios. La Casa de los Espantos and Echenme al Vampiro were horror comedies about a diverse group of people who gather for the reading of a will in a spooky old mansion. It features a lineup of second banana Mexican comedians including Mantequilla, Borolas, and Pompin Iglesias. Ironically, while several fake vampires appear in the first movie, no vampires, real or fake, are seen in the sequel, Echenme al Vampiro, despite the film's title, which must have disappointed K. Gordon Murray. Murray's new main title artwork for this film includes a sinister, lurking figure, which was as close as audiences would get to seeing a vampire in this movie. Two of the most interesting vampire films of the decade, El Vampiro Sangriento and its sequel, La Invasión de los Vampiros, went into production in December 1961. Principal photography was completed by the 23rd of January 1962. Santo vs. Las Mujeres Vampiro was also shot at the Churubusco Studios in January 1962, illustrating how popular vampires were at this time in Mexican cinema. The success of El Vampiro Sangriento and La Invasión de los Vampiros is in large part attributable to their auteur, Miguel Moraita. Miguel Moraita Martinez was born in Spain in 1907. A military officer with conflicting loyalties, although he was distantly related to Francisco Franco, he fought on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. Moraita left his native land and eventually emigrated to Mexico. Having had some prior experience in film publicity, Moraita found work in the Mexican film industry as a screenwriter and director. While he directed films written by other people and wrote films made by other directors, the majority of Moraita's movies bore his name as both director and sole screenwriter, a relative rarity in Mexican cinema. Moraita had previously made some borderline fantasy films, but the Vampiro Sangriento series was his first and only venture into outright horror. He did helm Dr. Satan in 1966, but that was a mixture of fantasy and James Bondian-type intrigue, and Moraita's only other foray into the genre was the comedic Capulina contra los monstruos in 1973. Both El Vampiro Sangriento and La Invasión de los Vampiros are stylishly directed with memorable opening sequences, deliberately weird soundtracks, superb photography, and atmospheric sets. The plots resemble gothic melodramas rather than horror movies, with relatively little vampirizing going on until the climaxes of both pictures. El Vampiro Sangriento depicts members and associates of the Cagliostro family battling the evil Count Frankenhausen. However, although his sinister plans are stymied for the moment, the film ends with Frankenhausen still on the loose. In the second picture, the Count has a rather minor role, mostly as a lurking presence with little dialogue, and is dispatched while in giant bat form nearly 15 minutes before the end of the movie. The climax of the film is the invasion of the vampires, in which a large number of the vampires' victims rise from their graves and go on a rampage. Some of the scenes of the ambulatory undead besieging people trapped in a house predate similar imagery in George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, made years later and far away. A coincidence? Perhaps. Count Frankenhausen is played by Spanish actor Carlos Agosti. Agosti had worked in Mexican cinema since the early 1950s and was often cast in villainous or at least unsympathetic roles, a pattern he would continue throughout his career, including numerous menacing appearances opposite El Santo. Erna Marta Baumann, about a year and a half after her role as a vampire woman in El Mundo de los Vampiros, returned to play mother and daughter vampire victims in the two Morita films. Baumann was Miss Mexico of 1956, making it to the semifinals of the Miss Universe pageant that year. After appearing in a number of films in the early 60s, Baumann largely retired from the screen. In addition to Agosti and Baumann, the first film co-starred Begonia Palacios and Raúl Farrell, with Argentine actress Berta Moss as the Mrs. Danvers-like Frau Hildegard, the vampire's loyal housekeeper and assistant. Moss returned in the sequel, but Palacios and Farrell did not. Rafael del Rio had the hero's role this time, and Tito Junco played Count Frankenhausen's disapproving father-in-law. El Vampiro Sangriento was dubbed into English as The Bloody Vampire, and La Invasión de los Vampiros became The Invasion of the Vampires. K. Gordon Murray reportedly released both of these theatrically in the United States before selling them to television, where they played for years. But the vampire decade was just getting started. There were more Mexican vampire movies to come.